Hey, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. My non-university unstudents, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a weird show where we deign for a few moments to set our emotions aside and do just a bit of thinking. One of the greatest miracles in the universe, intelligence, discernment. 7 billion of us on this globe called Earth have minds, but alas, what percentage of us actually turn them on? I'd be terrified to know. So, anyway, welcome. The mystifying book of Revelation, scholars tell us, was written during a time of intense persecution of Christians. So we're not surprised to know that the author encourages his readers to persevere. For example, in chapter 226, Jesus said, "To everyone who endures to the end and does my works, I will give authority over the nations." Jesus shares his glory. And then in 321, Jesus repeats, "To the one who overcomes, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself overcame and sat down with the Father on his throne." So that means part of it, being a disciple, is enduring, persevering, overcoming. Just how do we overcome? We draw on our resources: church, Christian family, nuclear family, friends, prayer, meditation, daily disciplines, prayer, worship, growth. Here's one the Lord put on my heart in prayer this week. Are there folks in your life who bug you? Me too. It's just part of the deal of existence. Why are they there? Well, at one level, to quote Seinfeld again, people, they're the worst. If you're around people, you're just going to get bugged. But at another level, maybe the Lord has placed them in your life so you can positively learn endurance, overcoming. Pray for them. Extend grace to them. Bless them where you can. But do not let them ruin you. Don't give them that kind of power. And know this, in the end, the Lord wants we disciples to be like him. Overcomers, perseverers. Oh, come, Holy Spirit, and breathe through us. Help us. Before we begin thinking together, here's a few observations in light of the last 6 months of Wu flu and 3 months of racial unrest. What a punch in the stomach, all of it. First, mass exodus. Across American history, the demographic move was to the cities. That's been a trend for what, 100 years? People moving to the cities for jobs, opportunity, relational belonging even. No longer. No mas. Dunzo. Gonzo. Because of Rona 19 and the violence, people are flooding out of the cities. People are burned out. I saw last night that thousands of businesses are closed permanently closed in San Francisco alone. It's being reduced to a ghost town at a fairly rapid pace. Restaurants are the hardest hit. We are allowed to go to Walmart, but not to Olive Garden. And if you ask nicely, you can go to Target, but not to Family Fitness. Here in Spudland, high schools are playing football, but parents are not allowed to attend and sit in the stands. Are you kidding me? That's zany. That America has put up with this is one of the most sorrowful things I've seen in my whole life. And if I stop and mull on that, I get seriously depressed. I'm not kidding. Where will all those city people go? Rural areas, but especially red states. The red states are not locked down the way blue states are. The red states apparently value freedom more than blue urban areas. So, How will the rural areas handle this massive influx? What will red areas do when blue area folks want to transplant their blue values? All of that is the new demographic question. It's weird to watch. And all kinds of books are going to be written to chart and track this dynamic of mass exodus. Then there's the topic of riot organization. The more I watch, the more I study the rioting, the more I am coming to believe there is indeed organization money behind it. Now, you know me, I don't like conspiracy theories. But the way the mobs work in and through peaceful protesters, use the peaceful protesters as shields, and use radios between spotters and vehicles to coordinate their actions, and rush in and then retreat, each guy with batons, and then they pepper spray and then they shoot lasers into people's eyes, all of that seems mucho coordinated to me. They've been through some tactical training. And state governors keep telling us that they've arrested rioters who've crossed state lines. Or, sheesh, we've seen this one since Minneapolis. But when entire caravans of cars pull up to a business district with bolt cutters to slice through chain doors, and others have electric screwdrivers to help pull down the plywood protective covering, and others have sledgehammers to break through the glass storefronts, while still others rush in to raid and loot the business? That all takes some forethought, some planning, organization. To me, it's really ugly, and I believe less and less that this is about unplanned righteous riots. And then there's the political implications of the ongoing Rona 19 and the organized rioting. I wonder, are we looking at a potential landslide victory for President Trump in November? Back in 1968, there was tremendous American civil unrest. Richard Nixon rode that unrest, presented himself as the law and order candidate against Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon won the largest landslide presidential election in American history. And it looks to me like the same phenomenon could happen this year, and if it does, it will have been profoundly ironic. Ironic because the Marxists, the progressives, have thought that both the COVIDity and the rioting would actually help them win the presidential election. It's crazy stuff. I guess we'll see. But I don't think it's impossible that Trump could win 40 states. Some pundits are saying he could win New York, since New York City is enduring the de Blasio sleeper choke, and New Yorkers are exhausted by the continued slowdown. No more Broadway, tourism is throttled, hotels are closing left and right, restaurants are facing final shutdown, families are tapped out from being shut in. New York State is in play? That's just wild. Oregon, too? Are the folks in Oregon exhausted by 3.5 months of Portland rioting? Are they tuckered out by the mobs? Are they exhausted with their businesses suffering for all of the reasons that rioting permanently wounds neighborhoods? Again, it's so wild to watch. We shall see. Hey, lexophiles? What's another word for synonym? Oh, and one more observation. Sports. I see the ratings for both the NBA and Major League Baseball are down 20% from last year. 20%? I'm actually surprised it isn't more. Way more. Then again, with society forced to wear these cement-coated governmental slotchy shoes, maybe folks don't have anything else to do? Hardly any college football. Here we are in the middle of September. Hardly any college football, although I just double-checked. Yes, the SEC football conference will be playing this fall. I guess they're pretty much the varsity division for the nation anyway. Whoever wins that conference should declare themselves the national champions. And I do see that they are broadcasting high school football games.
That's beautiful. Who knew that the COVID-19 Rona flu wasn't contagious at high school crowds, but is at college football crowds?
That's a big NO.
Maybe the plastic face masks block the spread of the Wu flu?
Nada. Folks can't travel so freely, so they turn the tube on to pro sports? I don't know. But me? I watch sports to get away from the constant political drone, to enjoy some highly skilled competition. The last thing I want? Some racist sermon from a sportscaster who's never read a book on the civil rights movement. Okay, today's theme? Marxism inside Russia. And Russia is important for our consideration because it was a nation deeply permeated by Christian values prior to the explosion of Marxism there. Most Western Christians, Roman Catholics, Protestants, all you unaffiliated believers, most Western Christians think of Russia and think of Christianity there as having been all about icons, those heavily standardized Eastern Christian art paintings. Me? I have much to say about icons. I've written about icons. I own icons. There is much about visual theology that would be good for hyper-rationalist Protestant Christians to consider to get you out of your own bubble. But today is not about icons. Today is about Marxism in the land of icons, Russia, which comes from Rus, the red, beautiful. Russia as a nation turned to Christianity in 989.
Yuck! I think you meant to say 1989?
No, 989.
Gosh!
So Christianity there had deep roots, a long history of commitments to Christ, His gospel, and Christian spirituality. If human nature is fairly constant, which I believe, then we can learn what happened to Russia when the Marxists took over. We can easily extrapolate what a Marxist worldview would do here, both since we've watched it at work in Russia, and because Marxist commitments are the same today as ever. China too, of course, but China is different because it was not previously Christian. Me personally? My mom's side of the family is primarily Russian. Their last name was Chirin. There's no etymology that I could find. Some Russian village, something to do with fishing. At one level, my roots make this personal for me, but really, it doesn't need to be personal for it to be, oh, so real. And let me qualify before I lead you down today's historical hall of horror. This is merely a scratch and sniff, a razor-thin slice. We can load our brains with stats and numbers and still leave with little real sense of the suffering and oppression, the heartlessness and hopelessness that millions and millions of people endured. I'm only going to speak of Marxism and the church, not what Marxism did in toto. Marxism is a demon in an angel's jumpsuit. Were people suffering under the Romanovs in Russia prior to the Bolshevik Revolution? Absolutely. Russia had spent a couple centuries since Peter the Great. He died in 1724. Russia had been trying to industrialize and climb out of a feudal economy. Feudalism didn't know how to get the masses out of poverty. Only capitalism has been able to do that. Did Russia, by trading the Romanovs for Marxism, merely trade a lesser monster for a worse monster? Absolutely. And that is the pattern. Marxism identifies and plays upon foment, plays upon unrest, foments unrest, promises deliverance, crushes a prior structure, and once ensconced in power ends up being a far far worse monster than the one originally overthrown. Every time. Marxism always makes things far worse than they were. All right, here we go.
Buckle up, Buttercup.
Marxism is a totalizing philosophy. I'm not going to work through its godless premises again here, but like a doctrinaire religion, it means to force all of life to bend its knee. It's not merely about economics. It's not merely about equality. It's about all of life. And Marxism yearns for unquestioned authority. Vladimir Lenin, quote, was adamant that every religious idea, every idea of God, even every flirtation with the idea of God is unutterable vileness of the most dangerous kind, end quote. Lenin said that himself. Hated religion. And just having said that, we can see why it eliminates everything and everyone in its path. Joseph Stalin, the tyrant of Russia for some 25 years, Stalin himself had attended seminary. Now this is interesting to me because it helps us see again that Marxism is a resolutely post-Christian, anti-Christian philosophy. It makes its foundations in the soil of anti-Christian hatred. Christians and pastors today do not realize, as I noted in episode 162, that Marxism is a grizzly bear that will one day turn back and bite off the heads of those trying to pet it, pacify it, mollify it.
Careful, kid. He'll bite your hand off.
Not even Soviet co-founder Leon Trotsky could escape that fate. He thought, since he had helped lead the Marxist Soviet Revolution, that he would be a hero. But his fate? Assassinated by an ice axe. His skull was split open in 1940 in Mexico City, where he was hiding from Stalin. Nikolai Berdyaev has argued that for Lenin, Stalin, and the Marxist anti-religious campaign, revenge was the soul of Bolshevism. It's ruthlessly vengeful. It will turn back and bite off heads of those who were trying to pacify it. Scott Lingenfelter wrote that when in the first year of Bolshevik rule, the Russian Orthodox Church lost nearly 20 bishops, over 100 priests, over 150 deacons, and nearly 100 monks and nuns. That same year, priests were taken for ransom, humiliated, scalped, beheaded, mutilated, or crucified. Some were forced to watch as wives and children were molested and executed. That's Scott Lingenfelter in a chapter entitled Empowering the Faithful in a book I read entitled Dangerous God. And then, over the years of Marxist rule, 300,000 Russian Orthodox priests were murdered in the Soviet regime. Now, yes, true, that was over the course of some 74 years, and I'm wondering, does that make it better? Easier for you to digest? 74 years? 300,000 divided by 74 is only 4,054 per year, or only 338 priests murdered per month. Not so bad, right? Holy God. And then, as I'm sure you know, the Soviets built concentration camps, gulags, forced labor camps all over Russia. Both political enemies of the Marxist state and petty criminals could be sent there. What constituted someone being a political enemy? Oh, publicly speaking against the government. Privately speaking against the government too, though, preaching a sermon some government official didn't like, teaching religion, teaching that individuals mattered, suggesting that all humans, even the handicapped, deserve dignity, whispering some vague phrase of governmental criticism to a supposed friend. All of that could get you sentenced. And when parents together were sentenced to the gulag, their children, their babies even, could be sent to nursery prisons. But you guys, it wasn't even just about politics. One could be sentenced to the gulag for being an intellectual, because intellectuals stir up the people, make them think. Turn your brains on, everybody. Thousands of business managers were imprisoned. They were leaders. Thousands of mid-level town officials, mayors, bureaucrats, they were sent to the gulag. Why? As leaders, they were threats. I mentioned last episode that a woman named Irina Ratushinskaya spent several years for having written poetry.
Poetry, Jerry?
That condemned Soviet policies. For 7 months, she was placed in solitary confinement with only a thin smock in freezing temperatures. The same thing happened to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He dared to publish writings that challenged, that critiqued Soviet brutality. That got him 8 years in a labor camp. And the annual mortality rate of these camps, it varied between 5% and 20%. Worked to death, mining and factories, worked to death, some 18 million people died in the gulags between 1930 and 1953. What was it like? What would it have been like to be in the gulag? Bestial, unspeakable, intentionally so. The very point of these concentration camps was to totally eliminate a person's humanity. Many camp operators actually hoped to drive the prisoners crazy. Here's just one short tale. A Leningrad theater producer, Theater Sally, a Leningrad theater producer named Natalia Lazareva was sentenced to labor at the Saransk camp. Author Xenia Denin writes that Natalia was running a high temperature, so some of the other prisoners demanded that a doctor come and examine her. Instead, she was grabbed by her hands and grabbed by her feet and hauled by 2 warders out of bed dressed only in a blouse and briefs. She was towed through the snow and thrown into a cart. The cart gate slammed shut and Natalia screamed for help. The major kicked her with his heavy boot once, twice, 3 times. Then all the soldiers fell on her, kicking her into unconsciousness. Right? You won't say only Black Lives Matter? Watch your back, baby. Watch your back. Here's some more about Christianity and the churches. By 1939, which was the start of World War II under Joseph Stalin, by 1939, 85% of the Russian clergy and monastics were arrested, killed, or forcibly removed from their positions. 85%. Also at the start of World War II, just 22 years after the 1917 October Revolution, there were only 100 churches left open in the Soviet Union. 100 out of some 50,000 that operated during the Romanov Empire. And again, by 1939, there were no operating seminaries. All monasteries were closed. All dioceses were shut down. No church literature was allowed to be published. Just brutal. Just sweeping was the oppression, the marginalization of the church. Now, Stalin knew that the real battle to win was not with guns and grenades. No, the real battle was for people's hearts, their allegiances. And so for that reason, among many, Stalin hated the church. The church generates beauty, invites shared allegiance. One of the ruthless quotes from Stalin I came across in researching for this episode was, quote, "The production of souls is more important than the production of tanks." Stalin and the Soviets wanted to produce new men. Now, frankly, that was the aim of much of modernism. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche, the father of nihilism, sought the same thing. He wanted Übermensch, supermen who would rise up, cast off the shackles of tradition and old history, and go on to create a new reality. Stalin was of the same mindset. He wanted to produce a, quote, new Soviet man, a man of new consciousness, a man who realized that all there was in life was power and matter, and that both power and matter needed to be tamed and mastered. Stalin was a man whose sole devotion was the state. The church? The church stood in the way of that new consciousness. And it's true, Joseph. Souls are far more important than tanks. More on all of this atrocity in a minute, but first I need to pause and make a quick shout out to some friends who've been helping me. Thank you, Miles and Devise, for your generosity. Thank you, Colleen S., Victor S., Glenn T., Darren G., Debbie M.L., and Missy D. My heartfelt gratitude to you all for your social media shares and love. I'm so appreciative of all that and for you helping me out in both small and big ways. You guys, I'm in the middle of a substantial advertising campaign. You want to help? Go to Patreon and sign up for a monthly pledge. You can do that for $1 a month or $100 a month. All that kind of help is wonderful. And then just to everyone, thank you for your prayers and your consideration. The brutality of the Marxist Soviet empire on the church was just brutal, but there was a strategy to it. How does one erase a Christian sensibility that was some 900 years old in Russia when the revolution occurred? Was it as simple as destroying churches or teaching atheism? Obviously, yet. Stealing historic church bells and destroying churches, like toppling statues and graffitiing courthouses today, there's that symbolic element again in Marxism. Doggone it. Portraits of communist leaders were treated like holy icons. So it wasn't as simple as destroying churches. They would steal and destroy church artifacts. And they had to be careful because they knew that had a reverse effect, an unintended effect of generating sympathy for the churches being attacked. It's interesting, you guys. Today, scholars have recognized that the Marxist agenda utilized then and utilizes today a medieval warfare strategy.
Pardon, s'il vous plaît. Let me explain.
Mott and Bailey. Say Mott and Bailey, class. Mott and Bailey, teacher. In medieval warfare, a prince would fight invaders from a fortified castle or some tower or mound. That mound, motte, might have a thick stone wall or have parapets where archers could shoot arrows, or it might just have some wooden barricades around it. But the motte, the mound, the tower, the high point would be surrounded with huge ditches to slow and trap the enemies. These ditches or ravines, these indefensible open spaces, were called the bailey. Again, the castle or the fortified mound, the motte. And because the invaders had to traverse the bailey, again, the ditch or the ravine or even the moat, they would be susceptible to uncovered attack. Now, across history, there were many different ways to configure this twofold strategy, but the point is, whether the enemy was directly attacking the motte or merely moving through the bailey, they were susceptible to attack. And here's how that worked in Marxism. In Russia, it went like this. The Marxist army would roll into some village, steal the village church's bells and precious icons, and then burn down the building. And the army major would stand in the village crowd and say, "Religion is from henceforth illegal." And the crowd would all groan and agonize. And 2 weeks later, the same military major would roll into town surrounded by an entourage on his horse. He'd gather the crowd and pronounce, "On behalf of Comrade Stalin, I am happy to announce that the cathedral in Saratov is open for all your worshiping needs." Now, problems? First, Saratov was only a 37-day horse ride away. Eesh. Second, the new, air quotes, priest? The new priest at Saratov was in fact a KGB agent. So the strategy: close the local village church, Mott, deceive the peasants with news about another in-use cathedral, Bailey, Mott and Bailey. In both cases, the Marxist state won. They burned down another local church and took its precious emblems, and they lied to the peasants that the state was not, in fact, against all churches. They didn't want that sympathy to grow. They would say only the local church where the peasants could attend was burned down. Mott and Bailey. Now, did the Soviet state hate the church? Well, yeah, by its policy, sure. But when the people heard the state's words, it was both yes and no. But you guys, the yes and the no were spoken in a way so as to confuse the people. And either way, the Marxist state was always on the attack, always pressing, always looking to blind minds and change hearts. Or another Mott and Bailey Marxist Soviet move? Steal church artifacts, precious artwork, ancient Bibles, altar accoutrement. They'd steal all that, and then they'd tell the peasants that the money from that would be used to pay for food production for the hungry nation. Scott Lingenfelter reports that in the first 7 years of communist rule, some $20 billion worth of church artifacts were stolen. But hey, it went to, air quotes, pay for more food for everyone, so win-win, right, baby? No, Mott and Bailey. Doublespeak, confusion, constant pressing. Whether openly pressing or covertly pressing, always pressing, Mott and Bailey. Or here's another element of the Marxist anti-Christian strategy employed in Russia. If you can believe it, during Tsar Romanov's era, public school included 27 hours per week of religion. Under the Marxists, public religion was illegal. Now, at home, folks could pray, sing, recite prayers, pray in front of icons, teach their children. At public school, though, the kids were taught, and this was established policy, kids were taught that A, religion was for superstitious old cranks. The Stalinists hated that grandmothers, babushkas, they hated that grandmothers especially kept teaching their grandkids about Christianity, teaching them God judges people into heaven or hell. B, at school, kids were taught that religion did not square with a materialistic, air quotes, scientific view of reality. And C, at school, the kids were taught that religion was why they and their family went hungry, since religion was anti-scientific, didn't work. Mott, religion is bad. Bailey, materialistic science, which today is itself bad science because it's so truncated, right? Bailey, materialistic science is good. Either way, Mott or Bailey, you confuse the children. You reshape the attitudes of the children. You pit the children against their parents and grandparents. You change the nation, or goodness, so they thought. Because in the end, the Marxist experiment failed because it did not work. It was joyless. It did not produce food or clothing or industry. It didn't generate hope. It failed because it was a lifeless lie. Oh, my listeners,
We don't be fooled again. No.
that was going on at the public school. Still more Mott and Bailey strategy regarding schools: offer free public education. Back under the Tsar, families had to pay teachers in schools. Starting with Lenin, under the revolution, public education was free. Mott. But that education came with a massive shift in what constituted morality. Only correct socialist morality could be taught now. Teaching socialist morality was, founder Leon Trotsky held, a way to make Marxists. Trotsky believed that, quote, good communists were not born but made. Sheesh, you guys. Isn't that exactly what we're witnessing today, with public education being overwrought with transgenderism, racism parading as anti-racism, anti-Americanism, anti-Judeo-Christian values being woven in? Isn't that all what we're seeing through and through? Re-educate the children? You can effect massive culture change. No wonder teachers' unions today resist any and all homeschooling programs. Mott and Bailey. Mott and Bailey, whether it's an open attack or an attack under retreat, you're always pressing. You're always trying to move for more dominance. And the Marxist aim, as I've said throughout this series, is dominance. Not persuasion, not inviting, not dialogue. Oh my Lord, this is so awful to have to say. You may hate me for this. For all of today's calls for listening, for dialogue, so much of that is a pseudo way to generate sympathy for the Marxist agenda. I know that seems loud, but that is what is going on. How does one have a heart-to-heart with someone whose premise is that you're a racist whose values must be destroyed? How does one have a sharing conversation when the premise is you and your family are evil for being oppressors? It's a real showstopper from the get-go. Again, you guys, with the committed Marxists, the ache is not for sharing, it is for dominance, power. Should we pray for Marxists? Oh, yeah. Pray for God's blessing and involvement in their lives. Absolutely. Pray for healing? Of course. Pray for our nation's healing, the healing of black communities, a national turn to Christ. There will be no healing for racism outside of Christ. All of that. Pray for all of that, yes. Sit down at a table for a heart-to-heart, the aim of which is to eviscerate your heart? Me? I'm going to have to think twice. Anyway, the Marxist strategy is just not about sincere dialogue. Never involves sincere intellectual, emotional give and take. How do we know this? Professors. Even the most liberal professors on college campuses today are losing their jobs over perceived breaches of cult doctrine. Are they usually invited in by the top-tier administrators for heart-to-heart dialogue, given the chance to explain themselves before their termination? No, almost never. No, the strategy is Mott and Bailey. The strategy is today, Marxists and progressives make some loud, high-strung, nearly absurd argument. Then tomorrow they'll say,
We didn't mean that.
That's
not what we meant.
Today they'll shout, defund the police, Mott. Then 9 days later when they're asked, really? You mean defund as in eliminate the police? Then they'll say, no, sorry. We were just angry. Defund the police really only means deep police budgetary cuts, not eliminating them altogether. Mott and Bailey. And so, because they're not being granted their absurd point, eliminate the police, they're only granted a point that is a little less absurd, deeply cut into police budgets. Mott and Bailey. But the strategy is always attack, always press for change, always move the dial. And if you move the dial little clicks frequently enough, you will effect culture change. Mott and Bailey. Let me give you an example of another modern Mott and Bailey.
No woman should have to endure a back alley abortion with a coat hanger.
Now, when they're asked, really? Do you think that's how any abortions even happen? Well, they'll say,
Of course not. But we want to make the point that non-medical abortions are horrid.
and the result? More and more public-funded abortions. And then, what's the end result of a rhetorical move like that? Change, winning, power. Mott and Bailey. So, there's a ghastly summary for you of what the Marxist Soviets did to Christians, to the church. And again, let's be clear. The church is hated for at least 3 reasons. A, it garners loyalty. And the cult of the now does not share loyalty with anyone or anything. B, the church espouses a metaphysic, a vision of reality that is contrary to the Marxist materialistic metaphysics. And C, the true church teaches that Jesus is Lord. And Marxists, cult of the now, they hold that only the state, fashioned in their image, can be Lord. Well, what did the Russian church do? What did church leaders do? And the answer is that they took one of 3 stances. First, the first stance was to oppose the godless government. And that stance was eventually met with violence, often to the point of death. Russian journalist Geraldine Fagan reports from now opened KGB files that some 15 to 20% of church leaders took a stance of opposition. And not surprisingly, it was finally opposition that made the deepest inroads with the sympathies of the Russian people. Over time, they respected those who told the truth and who stood for the truth. First stance, the first thing church leaders did with respect to the Marxist government, oppose. The second stance was that they acquiesced, gave in, shut their mouths, did what they were told. Honestly, having watched 6 months of the American population mostly capitulate and obey governmental leaders, variously such that the suicide rate is soaring, that older folks are dying alone, that elective surgeries are nearly non-existent, that depression is widespread, that addiction to prescribed opioids is at an all-time high, and bankruptcies are the new normal. Dang, how I hate that phrase. Having watched all of that go on, mostly willingly, I believe it is human nature to simply acquiesce. Accept something reluctantly, but without protest, just comply. And most of the Russian Orthodox Church scholars say they complied. And the third stance? The church collaborated. They worked with the Soviet Empire, helped the Soviet Empire achieve its goals. Now, this usually involves some kind of payola. It could be a tacit payola.
We'll let you Orthodox keep a handful of cathedrals open if you'll just shut the hell up about Christianity in the public square.
Or it could be an even more unseemly payola.
Hey, Patriarch, we'll make sure your pantry is stocked full with vodka and fresh meat if you'll go along with this little game, this charade. Deal?
Dealski. There is, writes historian Geraldine Fagan, there's an ugly untold story regarding recent Russian history. Even though Marxist communism finally collapsed in 1991, the Russian Orthodox Church has never called for an honest historical study for the truth of church collaboration during the Soviet Empire. Never. There's even a name for that kind of cover-up. It's called Sergianism. Sergius is the name of an infamous metropolitan, and during the communist regime's early years, he did the most to help the Soviets crush the church from within. Isn't that horrific? Hundreds of thousands of Russian priests were murdered. 10,000s of churches were destroyed, and countless millions of lay believers were never to be heard from again. All of that done by communists to Russian Christians, and yet the church to this day has never called for an investigation. Wild. What is that called? Collaboration of the utmost, perhaps the most brutal CYA, cover your in the history of Christianity. It's so sad, the collaboration. What are the lessons? What are the lessons I think we should all draw from today's horror story? First lesson, you play with a grizzly bear, you're going to get eaten. The history of all revolutions, not just Marxist ones, the history of all revolutions is that early leaders who think they are players are always among the first to get eaten, killed, destroyed once the first fires of revolution have ended. Revolutions shoot off in all manner of uncontrollable directions. Pastors, woke churches, you think you're appeasing the cult? Please, oh, for the love of all things you, please know there's a good chance you'll be eaten first. Second, because American Marxists are not nicer than Marxists around the world, please go listen to my last episode, number 171. Because American Marxists are not nicer than Marxists around the world, what happened in Russia could easily, I believe, will easily happen here when a Marxist revolution finally breaks out. Acquiescent American society is kidding itself. Geez, the NBA, MLB, and the NFL are all taking the bait. If you just think that a few banners, a few well-placed lawn placards is going to placate the Marxist cult, come on. Me? I'm doing this series because I believe we need gatekeepers, watchdogs, sentries who will holler, "Look out, folks! There's a monster on the horizon and it's getting closer." What has happened elsewhere in Marxist revolutions can happen here. Third, please, pray for the church that suffers. Pray for Christians in China. Pray for disappeared pastors in the Middle East. Even though dark storm clouds are rushing together here in America, we still got nothing to complain about compared to the daily lives of millions of Christian brothers and sisters around the world who paid dearly for confessing the crucified Lamb of God. One of the chapters in the book I consulted repeatedly for today's episode, that book was entitled The Dangerous God, Christianity and the Soviet Experiment. That chapter, written by Xenia Denon, I will tell the best people in all the world. In that chapter, she writes how believers in the Gulag could feel it when family and friends who were not in the Gulag, when family and friends were praying for them. Prayer is strength. God changes things through prayer. Fourth, you must not only vote. Christ's disciples, please write your state and federal representatives and plead with them to take a stand. Too many of our political representatives are mute. They're terrified. They're terrified that that grizzly bear will turn and bite their heads off in an instant. But if they will not take a collective stand, then there is little to slow the onrush of the cult. The cult is emboldened like never before in American history. It's a cultural revolution. And they are funded and will be further funded like never before. Our representatives must organize and push back against the whims of the cult on every front. There are lots of lessons to be learned from what happened to Russia, what happened with Marxism in the land of icons. Again, let's pray for our country, you guys. Oh, your time is precious, so thank you for spending some of it with me today. Oh, I need to wrap this up. Thank you so much for listening today, you guys, and please go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on, everybody.